You just don't understand, Linda said, her voice metallic and cold. A woman is only truly valuable when she knows how to keep silent. I set my teacup down. The sound of ceramic hitting the table was small but sharp. Then why do you speak so much? I countered, my voice perfectly level. The air in the room seemed to crack. Ethan stood between us, his gaze lost somewhere between the two women, his mother and me. Outside the window, the rain fell steadily, reflecting the table lamp's light. My grandmother used to say, I continued, that love is not something you measure by silence. Linda gave a faint laugh, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said many things, but did any of them help her keep her own family? The words dropped like a blade. Ethan started to say something, then stopped himself. I looked at her, my voice dropping to a low register. No one gets to keep everything, Linda. Only those who dare to face things are left with what is real. A long silence followed. Only the wall clock ticked once, tock, clear and cold. I stood up and opened the window. A cool draft swept in, dissipating the tea's steam throughout the room. Perhaps you're right, I said softly. A woman needs to know when to be silent, but she also needs to know when to speak up. Linda looked at me, her gaze no longer cold but something more complex, a blend of fear and recognition. The door slightly shuddered. The outside light shifted its color. And that's when I knew. The past in this house had just begun to speak. If you thought this was just a regular dinner between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, hit that subscribe button, because in the next part, when the clock stops exactly at 11:11, an old secret will be unlocked, and no one in that house will be able to keep silent any longer. The house by the lake appeared just after the bend, morning sunlight spreading across the water, which lay flat and glassy like a mirror. The scent of old pine wood rose up as I pushed the door open. The air carried the chill of emptiness, as if the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for this one moment of being reopened. Ethan walked a few steps ahead of me. He placed his hand on the wall, tapping it softly, as if to check whether the memories were still there. I heard his shoes on the wooden floor, thin, dry, and so distant. A voice cut in from behind us. It was Linda, my mother-in-law, her tone detached. We're here to clean, not to remember. I turned back. The light streaming through the window frame cast a cold, white layer across her face. I managed a small smile, the kind people use when they don't know what else to say. Yes, I understand. But the truth was, I didn't understand at all. She had lost her mother. I had lost the woman who treated me like a daughter. Yet here we stood, in the same house, each holding on to a private pocket of coldness. Ethan looked around and spoke softly. The smell is just the same. I replied. It's warmer, but colder than before. He nodded, saying nothing more. I walked slowly through the living room. On the wooden shelf, nestled among old picture frames and tarnished lace, a silver clock lay motionless. The hour hand was stopped at 11:11. I bent down, my finger lightly touching the glass face. The hand seemed to tremble, as if it had just taken a breath and was now holding it. It's probably broken, Ethan said from behind me. I smiled faintly. Or maybe it's waiting for someone. He looked at me, a trace of confusion in his eyes. That's an odd thing to say. No, it's not, I answered. I was just thinking. Sometimes, even time knows to pause before saying goodbye. Outside, the wind gently nudged the pine branches. The light reflecting off the lake was so bright that I had to squint. I thought I heard the clock faintly stirring, or perhaps it was just the sound of my own heart. Linda walked past, holding a trash bag. She glanced around, her voice icy. She really did hold on to so many pointless things. I remained silent. In the corner, an embroidered cloth lay with its creases still sharp. I remembered clearly. She used to sit and sew it every afternoon, the sunlight illuminating her wrinkled hands, the needlework as steady as a heart waiting. Linda didn't look at me, only murmured, "You should go outside and get some air. It's all old smells in here." I nodded and stepped onto the porch. On the wooden table, the circular stain of a long-dried teacup was still visible. I placed my hand over it. It was ice cold. "God," I breathed softly. She always left her mark. Ethan came out and stood beside me. "Do you miss her a lot?" I didn't answer right away. Inside me, all the memories were intertwined. Her laughter, the scent of peppermint tea, and her advice. If you listen long enough, you can hear what even silence wants to say. I spoke quietly. "I just think this house is still alive. It remembers." He fell silent, his eyes softening. A light breeze passed, scattering a few dry leaves. The clock hand inside the room pressed another faint beat, thin, drawn out, like a single breath. Linda stepped out, shutting the door behind her so forcefully that the window pane rattled. "Don't stand out there too long. The wind is cold," she said, a hint of impatience in her tone. "Yes," I replied, but I didn't move inside. The lake surface before me shimmered with silver light. I thought of her, of those afternoons when she brewed tea, told stories of her youth, and how to love someone without losing yourself. I spoke softly, unsure who I was addressing. "Grandmother, I've come back." Ethan looked at me, his smile briefly tinged with sadness. He squeezed my shoulder gently, then turned and went back in. The door closed, leaving me alone with the wind and the silent clock. I stood there for a long time until the light shifted to an ashen gray. The lake reflected the window frame, and for a moment, I imagined I saw her shadow sitting inside, head bowed, hand resting on the teacup, listening to the steam dissipate. "Maybe it's not broken," I whispered. "Maybe it's just waiting for us to remember." Inside the house, a light flickered on, warm, but not enough to banish the cold. I took a deep breath, stepping over the threshold. The smell of pine, the smell of time, the smell of unspoken things, they all entwined, gentle and painful at once. I heard the clock hand move again, a slow, real, and living rhythm. And I knew, somewhere in this house, time had begun to breathe again. Linda scanned the room, her voice dry, like the sound of dead leaves being crushed underfoot. She kept nothing but junk. I paused briefly. The way she said, "she," cold and distant, made my heart tighten. There was something in her pronunciation of every word that made me want to turn away. Ethan didn't reply. He was bent over, tidying up a few old photographs. The light filtered through the curtains, falling across his shoulder and dividing his face into two halves, one bright, one immersed in shadow. I left Linda in the living room and walked up the stairs, my hand sliding gently on the dusty banister. Each wooden step creaked, a slow sound, like the labored breathing of the past. At the landing, I stopped. Her framed picture, Margaret, the silver-haired woman with a kind smile, eyes so deep they seemed to know everything, still hung on the wall. I lightly touched the glass. It was cold. Her room door was slightly ajar. The light inside was softer, as if time moved slower there. I stepped in, gently pushing the door. The hinge cried out, a long, thin, painful sound. The room was small yet surprisingly tidy. The blanket was neatly folded on the bed, and the rocking chair still faced the window, where the lake reflected the pale silver sky. On the table, a half-opened tin of peppermint tea sat there, the tea bag still carrying a faint, soft scent. I lifted the lid. The familiar aroma instantly filled the air, stinging my eyes. I could hear her voice in my memory, soft and warm. Peppermint tea shouldn't be allowed to get too cold. When it's warm, it reminds us that good things are still around. I closed my eyes, almost seeing her still sitting there, cup in hand, her smile slow and gentle. I carefully placed the tea tin back, afraid of disturbing the room's subtle breathing. By the window frame, the wind drifted in, carrying the mixed scents of damp pine needles and peppermint. I remembered the afternoons when she taught me to embroider and brew tea. She used to say, "The stitches must be even for your heart to be calm. When you sew, don't think of anything. Just listen to the sound of the thread passing through the fabric." Once I asked her, "Grandmother, why does the clock in this house always tick so evenly, never stopping?" She smiled. "Every tick of the clock is a breath of gratitude. When it stops, it means we've forgotten to thank life." I opened a drawer and found a small journal. The first page contained a few shaky lines. "If you read this, I may have gone far away. Don't let sadness silence this house. It once knew how to laugh, do you remember?" I smiled faintly. "I remember," I whispered. Below it were a few scraps of paper, a tea recipe, a list of lavender seeds, and an unsent letter. The first line read, "Dear Linda." I folded it quickly, not now. From downstairs, Linda called up, "Elena, don't touch my mother's things." Her voice was slightly shaky, but she tried hard to maintain a composed facade. I put the journal back, then sat down in the rocking chair. It creaked softly. I closed my eyes, letting the memory pull me back. Those afternoons. The light spilling through the window, the steam rising in thin layers, and her stories. About her husband, about the hard times, about how to keep your heart soft even when the world turns hard. I opened my eyes. The light had shifted, becoming more golden. On the windowsill, an unfinished piece of embroidery lay there. The needle was pinned in the fabric, silver thread draped across it, sparkling in the light. I picked it up, touching the tip of the needle, sharp and cold. Ethan appeared at the doorway. "Are you okay?" "I'm just listening," I replied. "Listening to what?" "Everything," I smiled lightly. "The air, the silence. It remembers her." He stepped in, looking around. "Mom will throw away more things. She can't stand the smell of the past." "Maybe it's because it speaks of things she doesn't want to hear." Ethan paused, then said quietly, "Don't make things harder." "I'm not trying to," I answered. "I just want to keep a little warmth. She taught me that." Linda called out again. "Are you two finished? I want to lock this room." Ethan sighed. "Come on, let's go." I nodded, standing up. Before leaving, I looked back at the rocking chair. It was still swaying gently, as if someone had just risen and walked out of the room. As I descended the stairs, the light was fading. Linda was collecting items in a cardboard box, her face expressionless. She said, "I don't understand why people hold on to things that no one uses anymore." I replied softly, "Sometimes people hold on to things to remember they were once loved." She looked up, her eyes meeting mine. For just a second, her gaze wavered, like a tiny crack in a layer of old ice. No one spoke further. Ethan opened the door, and the light from outside streamed in, casting a pale yellow stripe across the floor. I turned back, looking up the stairs, where the wooden floor still creaked faintly, and the room upstairs seemed to breathe with the scent of peppermint tea. I stepped onto the porch. The wind was cold, but the peppermint scent lingered on my wrist, warm and gentle, like a remembering heart. I whispered to myself, perhaps the only thing that doesn't grow old is the way we once loved. And as the door closed behind me, the clock inside the house chimed a faint tick, thin, slow, yet real. The afternoon was as thin as a single breath. Light filtered through the pine canopy, falling in slanting stripes across the floor. I was standing in the kitchen, holding a cup of peppermint tea I had just brewed from the old tin upstairs. The aroma was perfectly preserved, gentle, warm, and familiar enough to make my heart tremble. The back door opened and Linda stepped in. She paused when she saw me, her eyebrows slightly furrowed. That frown, though fleeting, was enough to contract the air in the room. My mother was superstitious her whole life, she said, her voice laced with a mix of disdain and fear. I looked into the teacup in my hand, the steam rising as thin as a thread. I replied softly, sometimes superstition is just a way for people to believe in something. Linda said nothing. She walked to the table, touched the edge of the tablecloth, and pulled out a chair to sit down. Her movements were very light, but I distinctly heard the rustle of the fabric and the faint creak of the chair. You know, she began, this house used to drive me crazy. My mother always insisted on keeping it intact. Even that clock. She glanced towards the shelf. She said never to touch it. Ridiculous. I sat opposite her, the teacup in my hand still warm. Maybe she just needed something that stayed the same, I said quietly. When everything changes too fast, people often cling to the smallest thing. Linda shot me a look. You speak as if you understood her better than I did. No, I smiled. I just sat and listened to her stories a little more. The silence stretched on. The clock in the living room chimed, a small, steady, and low beat. The house seemed to breathe. Ethan walked in, his hair ruffled by the wind. He saw us sitting across from each other, two women, two eras, and hesitated briefly. Is everything all right? He asked gently. Yes, I said. We're just talking. Linda turned away, pouring water into a glass. About my mother, she said. Elena finds it fascinating, I'm sure. Her whole life was just praying, lighting candles, and believing that a clock has a soul. Perhaps she just wanted to find a way to keep things alive for a little longer, I commented softly. She gave a short, dry laugh. Living through a clock? Sounds sad, doesn't it? Maybe not sad at all, I replied. As long as someone still has something to believe in. Ethan looked at me, his eyes showing a mix of gratitude and worry. I knew he was afraid I would touch something that shouldn't be opened. He walked closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. Elena, maybe let it go, he whispered. I looked at him, my smile fleeting. I'm not trying to dig anything up. I just hear this house is still talking, and I want to listen. Linda stood up, wiping her hands on a napkin. It's funny. Someone who's gone and people still believe they have things left to say. Have you ever tried listening? I asked, my voice calm. Her gaze sharpened. For a split second I felt fear. Not fear of her, but fear of the shadow of pain lurking behind her eyes. She answered, I listened enough for a lifetime, Elena. Then she turned and walked towards the stairs. The door closed, leaving behind the scent of tea and the small chime of the clock. Like a whisper from the dead. Ethan sat down beside me. You should avoid pushing her. She's not ready. I know, I said. But she's scared. Not of me, but of what she's never said out loud. He sighed. You're right. But please, be careful. I nodded. Outside, the wind swept through the window frame, causing the curtains to stir gently. The scent of peppermint still lingered, clinging to every small corner of the room. I set the teacup down, the steam dissolving into the air. Looking towards the silver clock, I saw the second hand just faintly quiver, then stop. Maybe it was just the wind. Or maybe someone had just passed by, wanting to say they were still here. Linda was upstairs, her footsteps echoing, heavy, steady, like the rhythm of someone trying hard not to tremble. I sat still, my heart settling. Every tick-tock seemed to carry the breath of someone unforgiven. Ethan gently touched my hand, his voice low. "We can leave tomorrow if you want." I shook my head. "Not yet. There's something here. I can feel it." He looked at me for a long time, then nodded, as if accepting there were things he didn't need to understand. When he stood up, I was left alone. The last sunlight of the day slid across the window frame, casting a pale amber color onto the teacup. I softly whispered, "Grandmother, if you have anything left to say, I'm listening." In the silence, the clock ticked once more, a thin, deep beat, like the sigh of a memory. And I knew the first fracture had begun, small but real. It was evening. The scent of roasted meat, wine, and candles mingled, creating an aroma that was both cozy and stifling. Linda had invited us to dinner to commemorate her mother, but the moment I looked around the table, I knew no one was here to truly remember her. The tablecloth was ivory, the crystal glasses shimmering with candlelight. On the wall, her photograph still hung in the exact same spot. Margaret's gentle face, her eyes seemingly looking down on all of us. Linda sat at the head of the table, her dark dress making her skin appear even colder. She raised her glass, her voice even. "Thank you for staying for a few extra days. I just want to wrap things up neatly. My mother left too much stuff behind." I offered a strained smile. I'm sure she had her reasons. Reasons for what? She gently swirled the wine in her glass, the deep red liquid circling the rim like a trail of blood. "Perhaps she didn't want anything to disappear," I said. Linda laughed. "It's not worth it. She left behind only worthless things." Ethan remained silent, his head bowed, his eyes fixed on his plate. He picked up a piece of bread, then put it back down. I realized he was stressed. Every time Linda spoke about her mother, he was like this, torn between affection and fear, between wanting to understand and wanting to run away. "Worthless to you, but maybe valuable to others," I said softly. Linda put her glass down. "You say that because you don't understand. Her whole life, she lived only with memories. The only thing she left me was a feeling of guilt." The air thickened. The candle nearest to me flickered, as if about to go out. I glanced up at the wall clock. It was still in its place, the silver hands reflecting the candlelight. Each time it ticked, I felt as if someone wanted to say something, but swallowed the words just in time. Every tick seemed to be a suppressed objection. Ethan poured his mother more wine. No one spoke. The light scrape of a knife on a plate was thin, like a taut string. Linda broke the silence first. "My mother used to say that material things don't matter. Love is the true value." But then she kept everything like treasures, from a cracked porcelain teacup to those old letters. Hypocrisy, don't you think? I replied quietly, "No. Sometimes people hold on to things because they are afraid of forgetting how to love." Ethan glanced at me. His look was a plea, "Don't continue, please." But the words were already out, and there was no taking them back. She once said, "One should not weigh affection with a price tag." The moment I finished the sentence, the whole table froze. The only sound was the clock ticking in the silence. Linda looked up, her smile cold as a blade. "Who told you that quote?" I knew I had slipped up, but I didn't retract the statement. "She did. Once when I was making tea with her." Linda put down her knife. My mother always had a talent for making people believe they were special. Then she disappears, leaving behind a heap of superfluous emotions. You believe that too? I maintained my composure. Not belief, it's remembrance. She tilted her head, her smile still there, sharp as a needle. That's strange. You knew my mother for a few months, yet you speak as if you understood her whole life. There are some things that don't require time to understand, I said. The atmosphere dropped like a thin sheet of ice. Ethan looked up, his voice shaking. Mom, please, let's not. It's all right, Ethan, Linda cut in, her eyes still on me. I'm just curious. My daughter-in-law seems very attached to the dead. I placed my fork down. The dead sometimes speak the truth more clearly than the living. That sentence landed on the table like a shard of glass. Ethan clenched his fists, his knuckles white. Linda still smiled, but her gaze darkened. Interesting, she said, pouring more wine. Perhaps you should write a book. I didn't answer. The candle in the middle of the table suddenly snuffed out, smoke rising thinly into the air. A long silence followed, broken only by the clock's ticking and our breathing. Each tick seemed to press deeper into the stillness. Ethan stood up, his voice low. I'll get another candle. I've got it, I said, and walked towards the cabinet. As I bent down to find the matchbox, I briefly caught a reflection in the glass. Not just 3 people. A blurry shadow flickered behind Linda, small and faint, as if someone was standing there, listening. I blinked, and the shadow vanished. I lit the match. The flame sputtered, reflecting on her photograph. For a moment, I imagined she was smiling. I returned to the table and replaced the candle. Linda said nothing. The new light shone on her face, half in light, half in shadow, like a divided portrait. Ethan sighed, putting his hand on my shoulder. Enough for tonight. I nodded. Linda collected the wine glasses, speaking as if to reassure herself. Tomorrow I'll call the appraiser. The house needs to be cleared. I looked toward the clock. The hands were still there, moving slowly, decisively. Every tick-tock felt like a countdown to something. As I stood up, the candlelight cast the shadows of 3 people onto the ceiling, overlapping, distorted, and with an extra small shadow behind that no one could explain. I glanced over, feeling a chill run down my spine. Ethan? I called softly. He turned. What? Nothing, I shook my head, just thought I saw something. Linda blew out the candle, her voice calm. It's just shadows, Elena. Shadows don't hurt anyone. But I knew that not all shadows are harmless. Outside, the wind blew across the lake, carrying the cold scent of water and old lavender. Inside the house, the clock chimed again, slow, deep, and real. A figure remained standing there between the light and the dark, refusing to leave. No one spoke again after the words I had inadvertently let slip. Linda sat motionless, her hand resting beside the wineglass. The candlelight trembled on the table, casting shifting patches of light and shadow across her face. That line sounds familiar, she said, her voice flat. My mother probably repeated it often. The air felt thick. My throat went dry and I swallowed the apology I couldn't bring myself to voice. Ethan kept his head down, trying to find a focal point on the empty plate before him. Linda picked up her glass. The wine swirled, then stilled in midair. She looked through the deep red liquid as if gazing into a distant memory. Funny, she remarked, dropping the word softly. People tend to remember the things that aren't worth remembering. Then she stood up, pushing her chair back. It must be late. I'm tired. Ethan started to say something, but she had already turned away. The sound of her heels echoed slowly on the wooden floor, blending with the clock's low, solitary rhythm. I cleared the table with Ethan in silence. When he took the trash out, I was left alone. The candles were nearly spent, the light fading.
I distinctly heard one more tick from the clock. Low, heavy, like the house's final breath. I suddenly felt uncomfortable with the silence. It felt like it was holding back something unspoken. I walked over to the glass cabinet where Linda stored her mother's old items. My hand brushed over the rows of photo frames. Some were thick with dust, others almost entirely faded. On the bottom shelf, I discovered a faded wooden frame, its edge slightly cracked. The picture inside made me freeze. Linda, the grandmother, and a strange woman. The third person stood in the middle, her smile faint, her eyes bright, her face so much like Ethan's. So much that I had to reach out and touch the glass to make sure I wasn't mistaken. I flipped the frame over. A smudged,
shaky line of handwriting read, "For the child who never knew." I heard the blood pounding in my ears. Everything around me seemed stretched and blurred. Which child? Why did they never know? A cool draft seeped in from the window, causing the picture to tremble faintly in my hands. Ethan hadn't returned yet. I heard the wind outside on the porch, the sound of dry leaves sweeping across the floor. The scent of wine, peppermint, and old wood mingled, chaotic and heavy. I opened the cabinet a little more. A small wooden box was tucked behind the frames, old but clearly polished regularly. Before I could touch it, a figure reflected in the glass. I spun around. Linda stood in the doorway. The faint light from the living room outlined her in a pale halo. Her eyes were like cold blades. "What are you looking for?" I held the photo frame in my hand, my heart racing. I was just tidying up. There were a few things that seemed forgotten. She walked in slowly, each step making the wooden floor creak slightly. "This cabinet doesn't need sorting. I can do it myself." Her voice was low, but there was a tremor in it. I looked down at the photo, then back up. "This one is a little different. There's someone I haven't seen before." Linda stood right in front of me, the distance barely a breath. "It's none of your business." "I'm just curious," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice even. "The person in the photo looks like Ethan." "You're imagining things," she cut me off, her hand clenched into a fist. "Don't touch what doesn't belong to you." I placed the frame back on the table, trying not to meet her eyes. "I apologize," I said. "I just wanted to preserve her memory." Linda gave a faint, thin smile, like a fresh cut. "My mother doesn't need anyone to preserve it. Her memories should be buried with her." I was silent. The coldness spread from the window frame behind me. Linda bent down, picked up the photo, her fingers slightly shaking. "Some memories aren't worth remembering," she said. "They only make things worse." "But if people don't remember," I asked, "how can they understand what caused them pain?" She looked up, her gaze sliding past me like air. "You don't understand anything, Elena." Then she turned and walked towards the stairs, still holding the photo frame pressed against her chest. I watched her go. The candlelight reflected on her figure, lengthening her shadow on the wall, which gradually faded as she disappeared. Ethan returned just as I closed the cabinet door. "Are you all right?" "Fine," I replied. "Just tired." He looked around. "Where's Mom?" "Upstairs." I didn't mention the photo. There was something in Linda's eyes that made me understand it wasn't the right time. Ethan touched my hand. "Let's get some air." I nodded. Stepping onto the porch, I heard the clock in the living room chime a slow tick. The sound lingered, low and solitary, like the heartbeat of someone still holding a secret. I looked through the glass pane. The last candle had just gone out. In the darkness, something was still moving, like steam rising from a kettle that hadn't quite cooled. I whispered, "Grandmother, I think I just touched what you hid." And immediately after, the clock ticked once more, a small sound like a warning. Or perhaps an agreement. The morning was a blur of mist. Pale light filtered past the curtains, landing in patches on the scratched wood table. The house held its silence, every breath seemingly suspended, listening for what was about to unfold. I was sitting in the kitchen, the letter I'd found in the cabinet laid before me, the handwriting shaky, the ink bled by time. One section was ripped. The remaining portion held only a few faint lines. Linda, if you read this, please forgive. And then, nothing. I only want to understand, not to judge, I said, as Linda walked in. My voice was low, cautious, like someone navigating a pitch-dark room. I looked up, meeting her gaze directly. But why did you hide your own mother's letter? Linda stood in the doorway, her face so frigid that even the light seemed reluctant to land on it. She lifted a corner of her mouth. What letter? I slid the paper towards her. This one. She picked it up, gave it a brief look, and then smiled. It was a sneer, thin, like a razor slicing the air. Some secrets, she stated, must die with the people who carry them. I replied, my voice perfectly steady. Or is it that you're afraid if you spoke it, someone might see that you, too, know pain? The room seemed to solidify. The wall clock appeared to swallow a beat, then released a single isolated tock. Linda looked at me, her eyes losing their sharpness, becoming deep, as if she were staring at a younger version of herself. You think you know what pain is? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I wouldn't presume to know, I countered. But if you keep hiding it, who will ever understand what you've had to bear? A long, slightly shaky breath escaped her. You have no idea what you're touching, she said. After a silent beat, she turned away, clutching the letter so tightly the edges crumpled. I stood up, walking slowly towards the table. Perhaps, but someone intended for this to be read. Otherwise, it would have been burned long ago. Linda spun around, A thin flash of anger igniting her eyes. Do you think my mother was a saint? She only lectured on morality to hide her own shame. Maybe, I said softly. But people don't write letters to boast. They write when they feel no one is listening anymore. She laughed, but this time it was hollow, echoing as if from an empty chamber. You're a good listener. I'll give you that. Have you ever wondered why I won't let Ethan read these things? Because it will destroy everything. The family, the peace, the story we built. I shook my head. What peace can exist if it's built on silence? Linda backed away, steadying herself against a chair. You make it sound so noble, but real life isn't a novel. People survive on the things they leave unsaid. I moved closer, my voice low, and die in them. Silence. Only the clock remained. Tick, 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 counting down to something. She sat down, her eyes fixed on the letter, her breathing shallow. I used to think speaking it would make things lighter, she whispered. But it didn't. It made things twice as heavy. My mother chose silence so I wouldn't have to feel shame. And now you want me to dig that up? I placed my hand on the table, not breaking eye contact. I don't want you to dig it up. I just want you to stop running from yourself. She smiled faintly, her voice tired. You're young, so you still believe people can start over. No one is ever too old to be honest, I said. You just have to dare to look. Linda looked at me for a very long moment. Her eyes changed. The sharp edges were gone, replaced only by the profound weariness of someone who has stood too long in the dark. "I had another child," she said abruptly. I held my breath. "Not Ethan," she continued. "A different one. But they disappeared before they ever knew who I was." I stood stunned. All the scattered pieces of memory, the old photograph, the inscription "For the child who never knew," snapped into place. Linda clenched her hand. "My mother said if I kept silent, everything would be peaceful. But nothing was peaceful. I just learned how to silence the noise inside myself." I walked slowly back, placing the letter on the table. "Then let time speak for you." Linda didn't answer. The light from the window fell on her face, illuminating every wrinkle. Not marks of age, but scars of things never spoken. I stepped back. No one said anything more. The wind from the lake blew in, gently stirring the curtain. On the table, steam rose from the freshly boiled teapot, faint, like the breath of memory, dissolving in the morning light. And somewhere the clock's hand quivered softly, as if time itself had just sighed. Since that morning, Linda's gaze had been colder toward me than usual. There were no more polite pleasantries, no more teacups set by my chair, only subtle nods, just enough to acknowledge my existence. Ethan didn't notice. He was preoccupied with work, with long calls, with city projects I no longer asked about. The lakeside house returned to its quiet state, but it was a false stillness, thick like a layer of dust on old wood. Every morning, Linda read the newspaper in the kitchen. I poured coffee, listening to the sound of the spoon tapping the cup. No one broke the silence. Only the clock continued to tick, beat by beat, the sound of something unfinished. When she went outside to water the flowers, I sat back down at the table. In front of me were the old scraps of paper, the shaky handwriting, and a notebook I had recently bought. I started taking notes, dates on the letters, small symbols on the edges of the paper, the way she signed her name. Sometimes I wrote only a few lines, other times a whole page, as if every word pulled me deeper into a darkness that Linda herself wanted no one to touch. With every line I wrote, the clock ticked as a reminder. The sound was no longer steady, sometimes slow, sometimes fast, as if reacting to my every thought. On the third afternoon, Ethan walked into the room while I was bent over the table. He looked at the notebook, his eyes showing a mix of surprise and worry. "What are you looking for?" I looked up, still holding the pen. "The truth," I said. He frowned. "Elena, don't. Please. Mom's been through enough." "It's not because I want to destroy anything," I replied softly. "It's because she wants me to find it." He fell silent. The sunlight hit his face, slicing his features in half, one side bright, the other seemingly submerged in mist. "Sometimes," he said, "digging hurts more than healing." I nodded. "I know. But sometimes pain is the only way to heal." He walked over, placing his hand on my shoulder, his fingers gently squeezing. "You are more like her than you realize," he said, then left the room. I watched him go, my heart feeling both warm and cold. Maybe he was right. I was becoming the only person in this house who dared to hear the things no one wanted to hear. That evening, after Linda went to bed, I went down to the living room. Moonlight shone through the curtains, falling in silver streaks across the floor. I opened the clock, checking the old mechanism. Inside, a small piece of paper fell out, almost accidentally. I unfolded it. It was just a few numbers and a single letter, E. The ink was smudged, so faint that I would have missed it if not for the light. My heart pounded. E. It could be Ethan, or Elena, or Emily, the name that had appeared in the photo. I copied it into my notebook, then closed the clock. When I looked up, Linda was standing in the doorway. I couldn't tell how long she had been there. "Aren't you asleep?" she asked, her voice so composed I couldn't guess what she had overheard. "Insomnia," I replied, gently placing the notebook aside. "Just writing a few things down to clear my head." She walked in slowly, her eyes darting to the open page. "You still believe in all that, don't you? The letters, the clock, the past." "I don't believe," I said. "I just listen." Linda stood closer. The scent of lavender from her robe reminded me of the grandmother, the scent of those who live between the past and the present. "Be careful, Elena," she said. "The past is not always kind." Her voice was soft, but it resonated in my chest like a warning. I nodded gently, offering a faint smile. "And the present?" "The present," she said, looking straight into my eyes, "is what can kill you when you think you are safe." She turned away, her shadow stretching long across the floor, dividing the room into two halves, one light, one dark. I stood there, motionless, listening to the sound of her slippers receding. The clock on the wall ticked once, a long beat, and then stopped. I looked up. The second hand was frozen at the familiar position, 11:11. The room fell silent as if it had just swallowed a breath. I put my hand on my chest, feeling my own heartbeat blend into that silence. "Okay," I whispered. "If you want me to stop, just say it." But nothing replied, except for the gentle rush of wind against the curtains and the faint scent of peppermint in the air. I softly wrote on the last page, "When silence lasts too long, sometimes it starts speaking in other ways." Then I closed the notebook, looking toward the staircase. Up there, a small streak of light seemed to have just moved, quick, then gone. It might just be a shadow, or it might be someone was listening. That night, I sat by the window, my notebook in hand. Moonlight spilled onto the lake, shimmering like shards of broken glass. Beside me, the silver clock still rested at 11:11, but I sensed it wasn't completely dead. At times, the hand quivered faintly, like a weak breath. I spoke softly, almost only to myself. But it also never stays silent forever. The air inside the house seemed to respond. A gentle draft swept through, causing the curtains to flutter. The cold touch on my skin made me shiver. Then I heard it, very faintly, the clock moving. This time it wasn't an illusion. A slow tick-tock sounded in the middle of the night, the silver hand flashing in the moonlight on the glass face. I held my breath, listening. Each beat felt like a lost heartbeat finding its way home. I stood up, holding the clock. Behind the hazy glass, something was reflected. I couldn't tell if it was the moon or just a memory. Her voice seemed to echo from somewhere. "When you hear time stir, it means the past is about to speak." I knew I couldn't sleep anymore. The next morning, I drove to the small church where the grandmother used to pray. It stood on the side of a hill, nestled among old oak trees, its roof tiles faded by the rain. The scent of incense and melted wax hung in the air, the smell of unforgiven words. I walked in. The air was cold, but there was a warmth deep inside, perhaps due to the faint, gentle piano practice in the next room, fragmented and sweet. On a wooden table near the window lay an old Bible. The leather cover was cracked, the page edges yellowed. I recognized it immediately. This book used to sit on her table, beside the photo frame in the tea tin. I opened it, the pages thin as a dragonfly's wing. Tucked between two passages, a small folded letter was clipped. The paper was textured, ivory-colored. I drew it out, opening it slowly. afraid the words would dissolve upon touching the light. The first line stole my breath. My daughter. If you are ever brave enough, tell Ethan that you are his true mother. I reread it twice, 3 times. Every word was like a fine blade, plunged deep into my heart. I was numb. The air around me thickened, grew colder. All sound vanished. There was only the sound of blood rushing in my ears, and the echo of my own breath. Linda. She was the one who abandoned her child. I squeezed the letter in my hand, sinking onto the wooden bench. Light from the stained glass window shone upon me, breaking into shards of blue, purple, and gold, cascading onto my face like an unwitnessed ritual. I thought about Ethan, about his face, the way he bowed his head when his mother spoke, the way he offered a reluctant smile every time she touched his arm. Perhaps, somewhere deep inside, he always felt something was askew, as if her love always carried the scent of guilt. I held the letter closer to the light. At the bottom, the signature was a faded symbol, M. Not Linda, not Margaret. Perhaps an intermediary or someone who helped them keep this secret. I touched the name Ethan. The ink blurred against my fingertip, leaving a thin, dark streak, like an unhealed wound. God, I whispered. How could she? Outside, the church bell tolled, slow and mournful. Each prolonged chime sounded like an endless regret. I folded the letter and put it into my coat pocket. My hands were shaking. I wanted to go home, but my feet wouldn't move. Everything around me suddenly took on a different shape. The pews, the wooden statues, the window frames. They all seemed to be listening. The secret was out, and it couldn't be taken back. When I left the church, a light rain began to fall. The drops landed on my shoulder, cold but clarifying. I looked up at the pale gray sky, my mind full of questions. Linda had lived her whole life with that guilt. She chose silence, choosing to pretend she was strong and cold. But that very silence was the loudest scream of all. I drove home through the thin rain. The lake shimmered in the distance like a trembling mirror. I gripped the steering wheel, my breathing shallow. In my mind, the image of Linda, the letter, and Ethan's face overlapped, swirling into a crashing wave. As the car stopped in front of the porch, the clock inside the house chimed again. No longer steady, but hurried, rushed, as if giving a warning. I stepped inside. Linda was sitting in the living room, the lamplight falling obliquely on her face. On the table, the old photo frame was gone. She looked up, her smile thin and weary. "Where have you been so late?" I stood there, offering no reply. In my coat pocket, the letter still felt warm, as if radiating its own heat. A gift from the past, vanished here, but found elsewhere. And I knew, from this moment on, no one in that house could pretend to be peaceful anymore. In the morning, a thick mist lay over the lake. I sat by the window, the letter still in my hand, carrying the scent of damp paper. Pale light filtered through the curtains, falling onto the edge of the table where the silver clock rested motionlessly. Inside, I could hear the hands moving very softly, a steady beat, like the breath of someone returning to life. Everything seemed different since I read the letter at the church. Grandmother, Margaret, had chosen to carry that secret with her. She kept it to shield Linda from shame, from the scrutiny of those who once valued honor over compassion. I closed my eyes, picturing her sitting by the window, the afternoon sun framing her silver hair. "Don't judge, Elena." Her voice seemed to return, gentle yet firm. "People can do the worst things believing it's the only way to love." I understood now. She carried the secret her entire life, and she left the clock for me, not as a gift, but as an unfinished last testament. I took out the Bible and placed it next to the clock. Every object now had its own soul, waiting to be called by name. The midday sun streamed through the window panes, casting patches of color onto the floor: indigo, amber, and wine red. I sat in that light for hours, neither writing nor speaking, just silently watching the letter and the small tears falling onto the faded script. The word Ethan blurred, pulling the name Linda beside it, as if the two names had long wished to dissolve into one. I wondered, if Ethan knew, how would he feel? Rage? An emptiness? Or just silence? The kind of silence that comes from being lost between love and resentment. In my mind, Linda's image persisted, the strong yet solitary woman, living in a house full of ticking, trying to make everything look stable. But stability is sometimes just another word for punishment. I stood up. The lake outside reflected the gray-blue sky, the same color as the coat my grandmother used to wear while picking lavender. I took the clock with me, driving back to the church one more time. Not to search for more, but to understand. Inside, the stained glass light hit the wooden altar, the shards of light interwoven exactly as they had been the morning before when I found the letter. I sat down in the last pew. No one was inside, only the scent of wax and the sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the door. I opened the clock. The hands were moving, a steady beat like a life returning. I gently placed it on my chest, closing my eyes. "I will do what you could not," I whispered. "I will tell him." The image of her returned to my memory, her kind face, her hands clasped as if in prayer. She didn't forbid me, nor did she advise me to stop. Only silence. And in that silence, I heard consent. When I walked out of the church, the wind from the lake hit me. It was cold, wet, and light, carrying the scent of peppermint and old wood. My hair blew back, my coat damp with water. On the cobblestone road, I paused. In my coat pocket, the clock ticked steadily. The sound spread, blending into the wind, the rustle of leaves and the rhythm of my own heart. It was no longer the sound of an inanimate object. It was a human voice, of someone who had loved, hidden, and yearned for forgiveness. I squeezed the clock tightly, feeling the warmth radiating from within. Perhaps just an illusion, but I believed it was real. The last light of the day stretched across the lake, the silver mixed with rose, like the breath of someone gradually being set free. I knew that when I walked back into that house, everything would change. The secret was no longer in the dark, and when it came into the light, none of us would ever be the same. I walked slowly along the lakeside road, the sound of my shoes hitting the wet stone mixing with the ticking in my pocket. She chose silence to protect Linda. But I will choose to speak to protect Ethan. Because sometimes love is not about hiding, but daring to let the truth stand at the dinner table, raw but honest. I looked up, the wind blowing across my face, cold but sobering. The lake ahead shimmered as if it were smiling. "I will do what you could not," I repeated once more, this time louder. The clock in my pocket replied with a slow, clear, firm tick, as if she had just heard me. Night had just fallen when the rain began. Small, steady drops tapped against the porch roof like impatient fingers. I stood by the window, the letter in my hand now soft and damp with sweat. Every line felt warm. The warmth of the writer, the warmth of a confession buried for decades. Ethan was sitting in the living room, the lamplight casting a pale, tired gold across his face. "What is it, Elena?" His voice was gentle, but I knew I was about to shatter something. I walked toward him and placed the letter in front of him. "You should read this." He looked up, surprised. "What is it?" "Something she left for us," I replied, my voice hoarse. He opened the letter, his fingers trembling slightly. The light from the table lamp shone on the yellowed paper. His eyes scanned the lines, then stopped midway. He read, shaking, his eyes vacant. I heard a sharp intake of breath, the rustle of the paper. After a moment he looked up, staring at me, as if he didn't recognize who I was. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice choked. I nodded. My throat was tight. I couldn't find any other word, just a slow, certain nod. He looked back at the letter, his eyes blurring in the lamplight. "No, it can't be." He dropped to the floor, his knees hitting the wood, still clutching the paper as if letting go would make it all disappear. I knelt down, putting my hand on his shoulder. "Ethan." He didn't look at me. "Mom, how could she—" His voice broke. Outside, the rain intensified, lashing against the window pane. The lamp flickered, casting the shadows of the two of us onto the wall, distorted, fragmented. "I trusted her my whole life," he said, his breathing shallow. "Every word, every rule, every tear. Do you understand? She was my compass." I held his hand tightly. "You can still trust her, it's just that the truth is different from what she told you." "Different?" He laughed bitterly. "She lied, Elena. That's not different. That's betrayal." I was silent. Through the rain, I clearly heard the clock ticking from the next room. Steady, patient, and cruel. "She was afraid," I said quietly. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid of losing the image of a perfect mother. And she believed silence would protect everything." He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "And you think silence can protect anyone? It just slowly kills everyone in this house." I nodded. "I know." He leaned back against the wall, his gaze distant. "I used to dream of a different mother. Gentler, more affectionate. One who could say I love you without conditions." His voice trailed off. "Now it turns out that person did exist, and she abandoned me." No words could soothe that. I just sat beside him, listening to his heavy breathing. After a moment, he said softly, "Where did you find it?" "The church," I replied. "In her Bible." He gave a dry laugh. "Of course. Grandmother always believed in atonement." We fell into silence. The sound of rain falling on the porch seemed to be writing the rest of the letter. Ethan opened the paper again. His fingers traced the shaky, cursive handwriting. "My daughter, if you are ever brave enough," he repeated, his voice halting. "I've heard that line somewhere before. She used to say it to Mom when I was little." I nodded gently. Perhaps she knew Linda wouldn't be brave enough to say it. So she wrote it, so that one day someone else would read it. He looked at me for a long time. "And that person is you." "No, it's us," I corrected. Outside, distant thunder rumbled. A flash of light illuminated the raindrops on his cheeks. He spoke softly, as if only to himself. "All this time, I thought she was saving me. Turns out she was saving herself." I placed my hand on his, squeezing gently. "Ethan, I think she still loved you. It's just that her love took the wrong shape." He laughed, his voice breaking. "Love shouldn't look like this." I whispered, "No, it shouldn't. But sometimes it does." The room was silent. The clock ticked again, each beat chasing after our breaths. After a while, he stood up, still clutching the letter tightly. "I need to go outside," he said. "This air, it's stifling." I nodded. "Go, I'll be here." As he stepped onto the porch, the door opened, letting the wind and rain rush in simultaneously. In a flash of lightning, I saw his figure standing in the downpour, the letter grasped tightly, the paper trembling violently in the wind, but he wouldn't let go. I knew that was the first moment he truly faced his own pain. Inside the house, the clock ticked steadily, like a heart that had just awakened. I sat down, looking out the window. Rain poured over the porch, falling onto my outstretched hand, cold, sharp, but real. And amidst the chaotic sounds of the night, I heard something like her breath, thin, faint, and full of regret. I whispered, as if answering, "I told him, grandmother. Now, no one is silent anymore." The clock ticked once more, its sound lingering in the darkness. A night that shattered, but from there, everything real began. The morning after the long rain, light penetrated the thick clouds, casting a pale white wash over the house. The rain had stopped. Only dampness lingered on the curtains, and the smell of wet earth on the porch. Ethan was sitting on the sofa, his clothes still damp, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. The letter was folded, lying on the table like undeniable evidence. I sat beside him, gently placing my hand on his shoulder. "Ethan," I said softly, "she didn't abandon you. She was just afraid the world would abandon both of you." He didn't look at me, only shook his head, his breathing weary. "You don't understand, Elena. The feeling when your whole life has been built on a lie." I squeezed his shoulder gently. "I do, because I too have lived in someone else's silence." We said nothing more. In that stillness, I heard the clock's hands begin to move, slowly but genuinely. The ticking resonated in the rain-soaked room, as if time was trying to reconnect a broken thread. The light shone through the hazy glass, reflecting off the table, onto Ethan's face. It was gray, but no longer lifeless. Linda didn't appear all morning. I guess she knew. No one can hide a secret once it's escaped the paper. In the afternoon, she called us down to the dining room. Her voice was composed, as if nothing had happened. "I want to have dinner with you both tonight, a meal, to lighten the burden." She called it the reconciliation dinner. The table was carefully set. Candles flickered, the silverware gleamed, and the tablecloth was newly iron flat. The scent of food permeated the air, wine, thyme, and a hint of cinnamon. Everything so perfect it felt artificial. Linda sat at the head of the table, holding a wine glass, her eyes meeting no one's gaze. Ethan sat opposite her, his shoulders straight, but his eyes unfocused. I sat between them, where the candlelight shone, casting light across 3 faces, 3 generations, 3 different kinds of silence. "Thank you for coming down," she said, her voice small and smooth like a memorized prayer. "We have been through too many misunderstandings." Ethan didn't reply. She continued, "I just want you to know. Sometimes people have to do the worst things to keep the most important thing." He looked up. "The most important thing is the truth, Mom." "No," she said, the candlelight trembling with her breath. "It is honor. It is the existence of the family." I placed my hand on the table between the two of them and spoke quietly. "And the price of that was a child growing up in a lie." Linda looked at me, her smile hardening. "You still don't understand, Elena. My mother, she pressured me into silence. I just followed." "Grandmother may have pressured you to be silent," I countered. "But you were the one who chose silence until the very end." Linda's hand gripped the wine glass until her knuckles were white. The candlelight reflected in her eyes, trembling like a dying flame. Ethan stood up, pushing his chair back abruptly. "Do you know how many years I wondered why I never felt truly loved? Now I understand." Linda spoke quickly, her voice shaking but trying to remain calm. "You don't understand. I did it so you could have a normal life. No one would have accepted you if—" "No one? Or just you?" Ethan cut her off. "You were afraid people would judge you, not me." The air in the room thickened. I clearly felt the scent of candle wax mixed with wine vapor, heavy and acrid. I looked over at the side table where the silver clock lay still. I stood up, walked over, and picked it up. Returning to the table, I placed the clock right in the center of the candlelight. She left it for me, and the truth. Linda looked at the clock, her eyes blinking slightly. That was my mother's. Yes, I said. And now it's ticking again. The ticking sound echoed, not loud but enough to tear through the silence between the three of us. She left it for me not to keep silent, but for me to finish the things she didn't dare to. Linda tore her gaze from me, looking straight at her son. You think I didn't hurt? Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head slightly. Pain isn't an excuse, Mom. Tears welled in her eyes but didn't fall. I lost everything, she said quietly, her voice breaking. My mother, my reputation, and now my son. I sat still, watching the scene, the two of them standing at opposite ends, like two poles of the same fear. No one has lost anyone, I said. It's just time for everyone to truly see each other. Ethan bowed his head, placing his hand on the clock. She once said every tick of it was a breath of gratitude, right? I nodded. He turned to his mother. Then, Mom, this is our first breath after everything. Linda said nothing, only watched him for a very long time. The candlelight illuminated her face, no longer cold, only exhausted, like someone who had just lost the most precious thing, yet felt a sense of relief. The clock hands moved slowly but surely. The ticking blended with the sound of the wind outside the door. Steady, patient, like the heartbeat of the house that had been unlocked after so many years of being shut away. I took a deep breath, looking at the two people across from me. The reconciliation dinner was not warm. There were no smiles. But it was real. For the first time in its history, this house had the truth sitting at the table. The candles slowly melted. I reached out and wound the clock's knob, hearing the small winding sound, and whispered, "Time will do the rest." Outside, the wind swept across the porch, carrying the scent of peppermint and a subtle warmth in the old rain. The house was breathing, and I knew the journey to find the true heart of this family had just begun. The meal ended in silence. The candles had nearly burned down, wax dripping into solidified white streaks on the tabletop. Only the clock's slow tick remained, desperately trying to maintain the weary rhythm of a house that had just weathered an emotional storm. Linda still sat at the head of the table, her hand gripping the wine glass. She hadn't touched the wine to her lips, but the light in her eyes had dulled, as if the alcohol had seeped into her blood through sheer thought alone. Ethan stood up, said nothing, and walked out for a moment. When he returned, he held the letter, the paper trembling as if it had just been awakened by the wind. He stood opposite his mother. His voice wasn't loud, but it was so clear that I felt every word drop heavily onto the floor. You knew this your whole life, and let me believe I was born out of love. Linda looked up. The candlelight shone on her face, highlighting the deep lines like old roads no one dared to travel again. She spoke softly, almost a breath. You wouldn't understand. I was just a frightened girl. Ethan closed his eyes, exhaled, then let out a bitter, hollow laugh, a lost, dry sound, like rotten wood breaking in the night. You are more afraid of losing your honor than losing your son? No one answered. The candle flickered, the light dancing on the wall, distorted and warped. I sat still, listening to both their breathing, heavy, broken. Linda put the wine glass down, her hand shaking. You don't know how harshly the world can judge, she said. Back then, if they knew, I would have been left with nothing. No family, no future, no child. Ethan looked at her with strange detachment. And you chose to live a lie, just to keep it all. It was the only way left. No, he said, his voice quiet but sharp.
It was the way you chose. Always a choice. Linda was silent. A drop of wine fell from the glass onto the table, spreading into a red stain, quickly bleeding between them. I watched them, my heart tight.
Perhaps nothing is more painful than when the truth arrives late. It doesn't heal. It only leaves a deeper but more honest wound. Ethan lowered his voice. My entire life I tried to understand why you never hugged me. Why every touch had a limit. Now I know. Every time you looked at me, you saw what you wanted to forget. Linda faintly shook her head. No, Ethan. I saw what I couldn't keep. Her voice fractured mid-sentence, almost a gasp. No one spoke further. The clock hands moved heavily, as if dragging the last breath of time. I was about to interject, but Ethan held up his hand. Enough, he said softly. He looked at his mother, his eyes wet but no longer angry, just empty space. Now, let me be silent with Hugh. The statement was as soft as a goodbye, but I knew it carried more weight than any accusation. He pulled back his chair. The sound of the legs scraping the floor echoed coldly. The door closed behind him, the hinge giving a small, dry, real squeak. In the room, only Linda and I remained. She sat motionless, her hands wrapped around the untouched wine glass. The last candle slowly died, smoke rising in a thread, curling and then dissolving. I looked toward the wall, where the clock was now silent. The hands had stopped completely, frozen exactly at 12, as if time itself refused to witness any more. Linda spoke softly, without looking at me. He hates me now, doesn't he? I replied, my voice gentle. No, he just needs the space to learn how to truly love you. She raised her head, her eyes red. Truly? Truly, I said. Because love isn't about forgetting. It's about daring to look straight at what causes you pain. She pursed her lips, nodding faintly, then stood up. As she walked past me, the scent of lavender was nearly gone, replaced by the smell of wine and tears. The room was immersed in shadows. I touched the clock. The hands were icy cold. Rest, I whispered. You've done enough. Outside, the wind swept across the porch, making the door latch rattle softly. In that silence, I heard the house's breathing. Slow, steady, and exhausted. That night, no one slept. The three of us, each in a separate room, were all sharing the same sensation. The truth had been spoken, and everything else was crumbling in silence. The house looked peaceful, but in reality it was trembling in the wind, as if the very walls knew that every perfect facade must eventually fall. Night was late. The lake surfaced dark like a forgotten mirror. The wind blew fiercely, the rows of pine trees leaning toward the water, rustling like hushed conversations in a dream. Ethan was driving, his eyes fixed forward, unfocused. I sat beside him, my hand clutching my coat pocket, silent. The car rolled along the lakeside road. The rain had stopped long ago, but the pavement was still slick with water, reflecting the yellow headlights that stretched out like a drawn-out memory. No one spoke for the first few miles. I could hear his heavy, punctuated breathing. His arm on the steering wheel trembled faintly, not from cold, but from a weariness that ran deeper than sleep. Finally, he spoke softly. What do you think she wanted when she left the clock? I looked out at the rippling lake. The moon was hidden behind clouds, only a pale light falling onto the water. She wanted us not to use silence to punish. He turned toward me, his eyes tired but listening. She knew silence could destroy a person. Maybe she understood that too late. Ethan managed a quiet, soundless laugh. Funny. My whole life, she taught me to be silent. Now silence is the thing she feared most. I nodded, offering a sad smile. Some people only dare to speak the truth after they've gone. But she spoke, through that clock. He bowed his head, his hands still gripping the wheel, but no longer driving. The car stopped at the side of the road, right in front of the lake. The wind rushed through the crack in the door, cold and carrying the scent of the water. "I still love her," he said, his voice choked. "But I don't know how I'm supposed to love her." I placed my hand on his. "You don't need to know how. Just make it real." He was silent, his eyes fixed on the water. On the surface of the lake, the moonlight reflected faintly, small waves hitting each other like whispers. "Sometimes," he said, "I feel like that clock. Still running, still alive, but empty inside." "You're not," I said softly. "You're just winding yourself back up." Ethan offered a weak laugh. "You always talk as if everything can be fixed." I looked at him. "It's not about fixing. It's about understanding. Understanding is sometimes enough to make things run again." He tilted his head, leaning back against the seat. "You believe that?" "I don't believe in miracles, but I believe in the human heart when it decides to listen." We sat still, listening to the wind howling over the lake. Beneath us, the water hit the stone bank, beat by beat. I pulled the clock out of my pocket and placed it on the dashboard. The faint moonlight shone on the glass face, the silver hands glimmering like an open eye. "Listen," I said. "It's still ticking." Ethan leaned his head closer. Indeed, the tick-tock resonated, slow but clear in the dense atmosphere. He looked at the clock, then at me. "It's still alive." "Because someone still listens," I replied. He nodded, gently touching the clock. "She used to say it stopped the day she died." "Maybe she just stopped to wait for you." He laughed, but tears fell onto his cheek. I said nothing, just looked at him. The man learning how to breathe again in the confined space of his own memories. The wind blew harder. Waves crashed against the shore, water spraying onto the car window, landing on my hand. It felt cold but comforting. Ethan said softly, "I hate her, but I pity her too." It's strange that both feelings can exist at the same time. "That is how children love their parents," I replied. "Imperfectly, but genuinely." He looked out at the lake, his eyes reflecting the darkness. "Do you think she knew?" "Of course. Every mother knows when her child still loves her." A strong gust of wind swept through. The lake swelled, the moonlight shattering on the water, the fragments of light flickering like a labored breath. I opened the door, stepped out, and let the wind whip my face. The air was cold enough to hurt, but I could clearly smell everything. The damp wood, the moss, the dissolving night. Ethan followed, standing beside me. We said nothing. We only listened to the wind, the water, and the clock in my hand, a steady, small, persistent beat. I said quietly, "Everything she left behind wasn't an explanation. It was a chance for you to find your own way to love her." Ethan looked down at the lake, tears falling once more. "Maybe that's enough," he said. I nodded. Enough. We stood there silent until the sound of the clock blended into the wind, becoming an indistinguishable sound between life and time. When we returned to the car, I placed the clock in the compartment between the seats. The last moonlight shone through the windshield, reflecting a small streak of light on the silver face, like proof that the past had been heard. And for the first time in days, Ethan started the car without his hand trembling. "Maybe it starts with not hating yourself," I said softly. Ethan didn't reply. We were still sitting in the car, the moonlight outside casting a cold silver wash over the lake. The wind gently rattled the trees, and the smell of damp water seeped through the windows.
The clock hand flashed once and then went dark. There was only the silence of two people who had said too much and now only knew how to breathe together. He rested his head against the seat, eyes half closed. "Not hating myself," he repeated, his voice like the wind skimming the surface. "Sounds easy, but I've hated myself for so long." I turned to look at him. "Try just one day. You don't have to forgive. Just stop punishing yourself." He gave a tired smile. "One day at a time, huh?" I nodded. "That's all it takes." We sat until the moon had passed its peak, the light slowly fading. When the car clock approached midnight, Ethan started the engine. The sound was rough but steady. We left the lake, leaving behind the water still reflecting fragments of shattered light. A week later, Linda arrived at the house. She hadn't called ahead. She simply appeared on the porch with a box of lavender tea in her hands, wrapped in her mother's old, now frayed cloth, a relic. I opened the door and saw her standing there, quiet as a part of the morning mist. "Is he home?" she asked. "Yes, but—" "It's fine," she cut in. "I didn't come to talk. I only came to sit." I invited her in. Ethan was in the kitchen, washing a mug. When he saw his mother, he froze, his hand still holding the wet cup. No one spoke a word. Linda placed the tea box on the table. "Lavender tea, the kind I used to make when you had a cold." Ethan only nodded faintly. I made the tea. The boiling water gave a soft sound and steam rose, blurring the glass surfaces. The scent of lavender filled the kitchen, light, old, and soothing. Dinner unfolded in silence. There was only the sound of cutlery on plates.
Small but steady. The way people who have hurt each other try to maintain composure in the same space. Linda ate very slowly. Every time Ethan looked down at his plate, she would look up, then quickly turn away. I sat in the middle, like an interpreter for two languages that no longer wished to meet. Finally, Linda gently put down her fork. "Son," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope to see you without a closed door between us." Ethan looked up. The light reflected in his eyes, dim and distant. "You never needed to wait for me to open the door, Mom. You could walk through it any time." She offered a faint smile. "You don't understand. The door I speak of is inside." He went silent. Her words fell onto the table like a spoon hitting wood. I looked at Linda. For the first time, she looked real. Not the rigid mother nor the arrogant woman. Just a human being, trying to stand firm amid everything she had lost. "He read the letter," I said softly. She nodded. "I know." The moment the clock started running again. "Do you believe in signs?" I asked. She looked at me, her gaze softening. "When a person has no one left to trust, they trust time." Ethan put down his fork, his hands clenching. "Time isn't enough for a do-over, Mom." "No," she said. "But it's enough for people to learn how to stop pretending." No one replied. Only the subtle scent of lavender tea floated in the room, mixing with the smell of rain from the porch. After a moment, Ethan stood up and poured more hot water. "Would you like more tea?" Linda smiled faintly. "Yes, thank you." He poured, his hand no longer trembling. Steam rose, creating a slight haze between them. When he placed the teacup in front of her, I saw Linda lightly touch the rim, a small, trembling but clear gesture. "Thank you, son," she said, her voice catching. The light in the room grew warmer. Not the warmth of forgiveness, but the warmth of two people willing to sit together. When dinner was over, Linda stood up and gently smoothed her son's hair. "You are like your father," she whispered, "always silent when you hurt." Ethan gave a weary smile. "Now I'm learning how to talk." She nodded, her eyes wet. "Good," she said. "Keep it that way." She turned to me. "Thank you for not letting us forget each other." I replied, "You don't need to thank me. I was only the one who brought the ticking back." Linda smiled, genuinely, for the first time. As she left, the wind gently pushed the door closed. The lavender scent still lingered in the air, reluctant to fade. Ethan cleared the table without speaking. I put the tea away in the cabinet, then turned back to find him looking at the silver clock hanging on the wall. The hands were running again, steady and certain. He asked softly, "Do you think she'll be okay?" I replied, "No one is okay right away, but she's moving in the right direction." He nodded, then smiled, a small, tired but genuine smile. "Maybe," he said. "Every truth needs a stranger to speak it." I looked at him. "If that's the case, you just spoke it yourself." Outside, the late moon fell onto the porch, shattering into silver streaks on the wooden floor. The clock ticked softly, a slow, steady, and peaceful beat. The house no longer echoed with a heavy sound. Only the truth remained, sitting quietly at the center of the table, radiating the warmth of a cooling cup of tea.
That evening, the house smelled of fresh baked bread and dried lavender hanging by the window. Pale yellow light filtered through the curtains, casting gentle, warm streaks onto the dining table, like memories coming back to life. Linda sat at the head of the table, frail in an old gray sweater, her face half lit, half shadowed. She looked up at me, her eyes wet, but silent. No need for words. Everything had been said in the preceding silences, through the faint touch on the teacup, through the hesitant breath of someone who thought she would never have another chance to be heard. I nodded softly, a small, subtle movement, but enough for her to understand. Forgiveness needed no language. Linda turned away, lightly wiping the corner of her eye. Steam rose from the teapot, vague as an unsaid prayer. Ethan sat beside her, quietly pouring his mother's tea, his movements slow and careful, as if afraid of shattering the fragile moment that had just been pieced together. "This tea smells wonderful," Linda said softly. I smiled. "Grandmother's favorite kind. Now it belongs to the whole family." She nodded. Her hand held the spoon, stirring the tea 3 times before stopping. A drop of water flicked out, landing on the back of her hand. She put the spoon down, her hand trembling. Ethan saw it, and gently covered her hand with his. No one spoke further. No need to. The light reflected in Linda's eyes. No longer the light of someone trying to hide, but the light of someone who was no longer afraid of her own shadow. "When you were little," she said slowly, "every time you cried I used to say, 'Be quiet, everything will be fine.' Now I understand. That very sentence made you silent forever." Ethan smiled, his laughter soft as a sigh. "I used to think that too. And now I know that sometimes fine doesn't come from silence, but from being heard." Linda bowed her head, pressed her lips together, her small shoulders trembling. "I'm listening, Mom," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She looked up, gazing straight at her son. Her lips moved as if to say, "Thank you," but no sound emerged. She only nodded, her eyes holding a lifetime of repentance. I sat there, feeling as if time was slowing down minute by minute, second by second. The clock in the living room ticked slowly, the beat steady and low, the sound of people learning how to love again. Linda lifted the teacup to her lips, taking a deep breath. "The tea is cold now," she said. I smiled. "But it's still sweet." A small chuckle escaped Ethan. Then came his mother's laughter. Small, tentative, then gradually growing longer, as if the house had just been given permission to breathe again, after years of holding its tension. The meal ended simply. No special dishes, no wine. Just toasted bread and tea.
But for the first time, the atmosphere in the house did not carry the heavy scent of secrets. While clearing the table, Linda stood next to me, holding a dish rag. "Thank you, Elena," she said, her voice husky. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "You did it yourself." She looked at me for a long time, her eyes mixing gratitude and regret. "Some things take a lifetime to dare to face," she said. "As long as you dared in the end." Ethan walked over, placing his hand on his mother's shoulder. "I'm going to replant the garden out back," he said. "Lavender, just like before." Linda nodded, smiling. "I'll help." A small moment, but within it, I saw the whole house change color, as if the light had just been adjusted from cold to warm. I looked at the clock on the wall. The hands were still moving, but slower, steadier, like the breath of someone sleeping after a long cry. I poured more water into the kettle and set it on the table. The candlelight reflected off the metal surface, creating a curved streak of light, like an incomplete smile. Ethan squinted at me, asking softly, "Do you think time can forgive?" I replied, "No, but it knows how to wait, if we are willing to sit still." Linda looked at the two of us, her gaze gentle. "Waiting is the hardest thing I learned," she said. "But maybe it's not too late." On the porch, the wind blew softly, leaves rustling together, a small sound like someone knocking with patient fingers. The house was calm. On the wall, the clock continued to tick, each beat clear, firm, and warm. No one said a final word, because it wasn't needed anymore. We simply sat there, together, in a room full of light and silence, where love, after years of lying dormant, finally began to breathe again. It was early morning. The sun had just risen over the trees, the light still thin and soft, like the first breath of the day. Linda and I knelt by the lavender garden behind the house, our hands stained with dirt, neither of us speaking. A touch of dew still clung to the leaves. The earth was cold, but the sun was warm and fragrant. I pressed a lavender sprig into the soil, gently patting the dirt over the roots. Linda sat opposite me, her movements slow but deliberate. She was still wearing the old gray sweater, the hem smudged with mud, but she didn't mind. "Years ago," she said, her voice even, "I used to think this flower was too fragile." I looked up. "Because it's small?" "Because it's soft. I thought something soft couldn't withstand the wind." She planted another sprig, her fingers trembling slightly under the sun. "But it survives even in dry soil. The drier the earth, the deeper the scent." I looked at the pale purple lavender blossoms, scattered like memories slow to unfold. "It's like people," I said. "When they have nothing left, they learn how much they can endure." Linda gave a gentle laugh, her smile no longer sharp, only kind. "Perhaps so." I stood up, dusted my hands, and went inside to make tea. When I returned, I poured and handed her a hot cup. "Maybe it learned how to wait for the rain," I said, placing the cup in her hands. She took it, her dry hands cradling the warmth, her eyes closing faintly as the steam touched her face. "Wait for the rain," she repeated. "I never knew I could wait, Elena. My whole life I only knew how to hold on." "And now you're doing the opposite," I said. She nodded. "Perhaps because someone showed me it wasn't as frightening as I thought." We sat in silence, listening to the bees and the distant clock. Every small sound merged, the hum of the bees, the gentle rustle of the wind through the leaves, and the tick-tock echoing from inside the house, slow, steady, even, like the mended heartbeat of the house. Linda put down the teacup and looked at me. "You know," she said, "sometimes I see Leela in you." I paused. "The woman in the photo?" She nodded. "Leela was my older sister. Grandmother sent her away when she was little. I always thought Leela was the traitor for leaving, but in truth, I was the one who abandoned everything." I looked at her face. The sun shone through the trees, casting thin streaks of light on her cheekbones. "You never told me that," I said. "No one asked," she replied, her voice light. People only saw what they wanted to see. A strong, put-together woman in control of everything. No one saw the rest, the part I feared, the part I broke. I was silent. She picked up a lavender sprig, turning it in her hands. "This scent," she said. "It reminds me of Leela." She liked things to be subtly fragrant, not intense, not trying too hard. I hated that. Now I understand. Some people are enough without trying. I looked at her. Her eyes were no longer cold, only weary. "Leela still lives in you," I said. "Through the way you plant flowers, through the tea you choose." "No," she shook her head. "Leela lives in the thing I once wanted to kill. Softness." The phrase made my heart tighten. Linda had traded affection for a facade her whole life. Now that the shell was broken, inside was simply a woman learning to be gentle. She looked up at the garden. "I don't know if Ethan will ever fully understand me, but if one day he looks at this garden and finds peace, that will be enough." "He will," I said. She smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But the thing I feared most wasn't that he would hate me. It was that he would become like me." "He's already different," I said, "because you dared to change." She was silent, her eyes fixed on the lake in the distance, the water shimmering brightly. After a moment, she said, "Yesterday, I dreamed of Leela." She was standing in the lavender garden, looking at me without speaking. She just nodded. When I woke up, the rain started. "Perhaps that was her way of saying, 'It's enough,'" I replied softly. The wind carried the scent of lavender through the garden. The petals quivered, as if bowing. Linda closed her eyes, her hand still cradling the teacup. "Thank you, Elena," she said. "For what?" "For being here. For not leaving when everything fell apart. You reminded me of a simple thing I forgot. Sometimes you don't need to be right. You just need to sit together." I didn't answer. I only looked over and saw the light falling onto her silver hair, reflecting a pale purple hue, the color of lavender, of old seasons and new ones merging. Inside the house, the clock ticked again, a low, distant beat, yet clearly heard like a heartbeat. We sat there, in the growing garden, in the windless morning, where everything that had once been broken was slowly but persistently learning to grow again. Linda spoke softly, as if to herself. "Perhaps this is the first time in my life I've felt peace without guilt." I smiled. "Then just let it stay." And we sat there for a long time, until the sun was high, the scent of lavender blending into the air, fragrant, gentle, and real, like living life at its own true rhythm for the first time.
The afternoon after the heavy rain, the sky was strangely clear. The lake in the distance shone like a freshly washed mirror. The wind blew through, the scent of peppermint spreading throughout the garden, mingled with the light purple of the still damp lavender. The flower sprigs swayed, gently touching each other like the greetings of people long separated. I sat on the back steps, my notebook open on my lap, my pencil worn down. Inside, Ethan was making tea. Linda was reading, occasionally giving a slight cough. No one was talking, but the house was full of sound. The creak of a door, the hiss of steam, steady breathing. The wind picked up again, bringing the rustle of leaves and the fresh smell of peppermint. In that moment, Grandmother's voice seemed to echo back. "When you know how to listen, even silence has a heartbeat." I closed my eyes. Her voice, soft as the warmth of that long-ago morning, when she used to make tea for me in the small kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window, tea steam curling around her old glasses. "Grandmother," I whispered, "I'm listening now." I opened my notebook, writing the first lines after weeks of silence. "Grandmother,
I understand now. Keeping the rhythm is not enduring. Keeping the rhythm is daring to move slowly, even if others move faster. Keeping the rhythm is sitting still and listening even to the things you once feared. My penmanship was shaky, but the words were steady. I paused, reread the 3 lines and smiled. A rare smile that wasn't accompanied by weariness. Ethan walked out, holding 2 cups of tea. He placed one down beside me, didn't ask, just sat down. The scent of peppermint blended with the hot steam. "What are you writing?" he asked. "I'm writing a letter to her." "Grandmother?" I nodded. The first time it's not to ask questions, but to say thank you. Ethan took a sip of tea, his eyes distant. "If she were alive, she'd be proud of you." "No," I said. She'd just smile and say,
"You finally know where to stop." He chuckled, the sound slightly hoarse, as if breaking free from somewhere deeper than sadness. Then he looked down at the notebook, reading slowly. "I understand now. Keeping the rhythm is not enduring." He stopped mid-sentence, his voice catching slightly. I hate myself for not realizing she was afraid too. I looked up. His face was slightly tilted, the afternoon light drawing a long shadow across his cheekbone. "She was afraid of losing everything," he continued. "Afraid of being forgotten. Afraid of not being strong enough. I blamed her for the silence, but now I think maybe she was silent because she had no words left that were strong enough to keep what she loved." I nodded softly. People often confuse strength with endurance. She chose endurance because she thought that was love. But now she'll be at peace. She knows you understand. He looked at me smiling, but his eyes were still wet. "You always talk as if she's right here." I replied, "Because she never left." We sat still, looking toward the garden. The lavender sprigs swayed gently in the breeze. Small bees hovered, golden in the late afternoon sun. Inside, Linda coughed softly and then went quiet. I heard the clock in the living room tick faintly, steady and distant, like the heartbeat of a house recovering after a long rain. "Do you think it ends here?" Ethan asked. I shook my head. "No. But there are some chapters you don't need to keep writing. You just let them drift." The wind gently stirred my hair, cold and soft. On the steps, his teacup still held steam. I picked up my pen, writing one final line. "I don't want time to stop anymore, Grandmother. I just want it to keep the right rhythm." Ethan read it, nodding quietly. "Keep that line," he said. "It sounds like a prayer." The sun had dropped low, light slanted across the garden, touching each lavender blossom as if coating it in a thin layer of gold. Linda walked onto the porch,
pulling her wool shawl around her, looked at us, and then smiled. No one spoke, but in that look, there was something very close to forgiveness. I closed my notebook, resting it on my lap, and looked up at the sky. A thin trail of clouds stretched across the horizon, like the signature of the day. "Grandmother," I whispered, "I will keep this rhythm until the wind stops." The wind blew past, the scent of peppermint spreading through the garden once more. It was no longer the scent of memory, but the scent of things still living, light, clear, and real. That morning, a thin layer of mist lay over the lake. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the tree canopy, falling onto the porch, small luminous spots flickering as if breathing. I stood next to Ethan, my hand woven into his. His skin was cool, but his palm held a slight warmth, the warmth of someone who had weathered many storms and was learning to trust again. I looked at him and said softly, "Fear doesn't make anyone evil. It just makes them forget how to love." He was silent. His lips moved, as if the sentence had touched a place he had never dared to look. A small wet bird landed on the railing, but still sang, its voice fragile and clear. He turned to me, asking quietly, "And you, aren't you afraid?" I gave a light smile. Yes, but I learned how to keep the rhythm when everything else stopped. The remark made him lower his head. The wind gently stirred, carrying the scent of lavender lingering from the back garden. I could feel him trying to hide the tremor in his own palm. "Do you remember," he said, "the first day we came here? The clock in the house wasn't running?" Of course. Back then everything was standing still. Time and belief. And now? I turned to him. Now it has finished its work. I opened my bag and took out the silver clock. Its casing was tarnished, the hand slightly scratched, but the face was still bright in the center. I held it in both hands, raising it to the light. "Now it can stop," I said softly, "because everything it had to bear witness to is done." Ethan looked at me for a long time. "Are you sure?" "Yes. Sometimes stopping is the only way to move forward." He reached out and took the clock, his fingers tracing the cold surface. The morning light reflected off the glass, forming a thin silver streak like a beautiful scar. He placed it on the windowsill, right where the sun was shining. We watched the second hand move one more beat, then stop. There was no more ticking, only the wind and our breathing merging together. He looked at me, a faint smile on his lips. "Funny," he whispered. "It's silent, and yet I feel more at peace than ever." I replied, "Because silence isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's the full stop of a beautiful chapter." We stood like that for quite a while, listening only to the wind through the garden, the sound of tranquility, the sound of leaves touching, the low hum of bees around the lavender, and the sound of my heart, slow, steady, no longer tangled by fear. Ethan wrapped his arms around me, not tightly, just enough for me to feel that I was still here, still grounded, still real. "There was a time," he said, "I thought love was holding on, trying to cling to everything so it wouldn't disappear. But it turns out, love is knowing when to let go." "Like time," I said. "It doesn't stand still. It only chooses to stop where people are brave enough to continue." He gave a soft laugh. "I don't know if I'm brave." "You are, because you're still here." The sun rose higher, reflecting on the lake. I saw our shadows lengthen across the lawn, intertwined. 2 figures, 1 heartbeat, 1 heartbeat. Linda walked out from the back door, a basket of freshly cut lavender in her hand. "Come have breakfast, you two," she said, her voice light as the wind. "We're coming," I replied. She looked at the clock on the windowsill, gently touching it. "It stopped?" "Yes," I said. "It chose to rest." Linda smiled, her eyes holding a strange clarity, no longer clouded by the fog of the old years. "Good. Because sometimes, only when things stop, can people hear their own voice." She turned back into the house. Ethan held my hand, still silent. I knew he was thinking about the years that had passed, about his mother, his grandmother, about the silences that had once suffocated him. But now, that silence no longer scared him. Above us, white clouds drifted slowly, forming vague shapes. The wind was still gentle, just enough to make the lavender sway. I leaned my head on his shoulder, listening to my heart sink with the sound of the leaves. "Do you think this is the end?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. It's the beginning that I'm no longer afraid will end." We looked out at the lake, the surface reflecting the sky like an unbroken mirror. I whispered, "Then let's start again." Ethan replied, "Start, but this time, no one has to be silent." And in that moment, I clearly saw what grandmother had once told me. When you know how to keep the rhythm, time will walk with you, not just pass you by. I closed my eyes. No more past. No more debt. Only the wind, the light, and the heartbeat. Real, slow, and enough. A year passed. Everything in the house had changed, not by replacement, but by a new vitality. A year later, I became pregnant. The news arrived on a quiet morning, as I was making tea and Ethan was watering the lavender garden. I placed my hand on my belly and whispered to him, "I think there's an extra heartbeat." He froze for a second, then smiled. The smile was so genuine, it lit up the entire kitchen. He pulled me close, his hand resting on my abdomen, his palm trembling slightly. "If it's a girl, let's name her after grandmother." I nodded, saying nothing, just listening to my heartbeat and the wind outside harmonize, like a peaceful affirmation. After moving to a small house near town, I opened a used bookstore. It wasn't large, just enough room for 3 wooden shelves and a reading table by the window. I painted the walls off-white, hung a few dried lavender sprigs, and put up a small sign that read, "For those who stayed." Every morning, when Ethan drove me to the shop, he would pause for a few minutes, look around, and say, "It looks like a place grandmother would have loved." I'd smile and reply, "I think so too." The bookstore became a space for people looking for a place to breathe. A middle-aged woman bought baking books. A 15-year-old boy chose novels with worn covers. And an old man stopped by every morning just to read a single page and smile. I never asked why they came. I simply greeted them with a small cup of mint tea placed on the corner table. One afternoon, after the last customer left, I leaned back in my chair and gently dozed off. In my dream, I saw grandmother sitting on the porch making tea. Steam rose, and she spoke to me in a slow, gentle, wind-like voice. "Time doesn't take anything away, my dear. It only teaches you to hold on to what is real." I dreamt of her hand trembling as she held the spoon, stirring softly. And then the light on the table reflected into my eyes. When I woke up, the day was drawing to a close. The lavender scent in the shop merged with the aroma of tea, and from afar, a gentle ticking sound echoed. I looked around. The silver clock had been placed on a bookshelf, nestled between 2 old journals. The hands were still, yet the light through the window made it shimmer as if it were breathing. I gently touched the glass face, whispering, "I know, grandmother. Hold on to what is real." In the evening, Ethan came to pick me up. On the way home, we passed the lake. He looked at me, the evening light reflecting in his eyes, a deep autumnal brown. "Do you think," he said, "the baby will remember her?" "Of course. Even without meeting her, they'll know. Because everything real she left within us." He nodded, gently placing his hand on my belly. "Then that's enough." When we arrived home, Linda was sitting by the window, needle in hand. The late sun shone over her shoulder, casting a soft silver glow on her hair, like dust motes. She was sewing a small blanket, the stitches even and meticulous. "This is for the grandchild," she said without looking up. I smiled and walked closer. "It's beautiful, Mom." "It's not beautiful," she replied. "It's just what these old hands still remember how to do." Ethan looked at his mother and smiled. "It's good that you remember." She stopped sewing, looked up, her gaze warm and distant all at once. "I didn't think I'd ever sew anything for a child again," she said, her voice slightly hoarse. I touched her shoulder. "You're sewing something more than just a blanket." Linda nodded softly, her eyes glistening but tearless. It was just the reflected light, making everything in the room softer, more humane. That night, as the family ate together, I realized something strange. The peace no longer felt empty to me. It had its own rhythm, like a deep breath, like the sound of the clock hands that were still but ever present. After dinner, I went out to the porch and sat watching the garden. The lavender was still blooming, Mint spread with the wind. From afar, the church bell chimed. I placed my hand over my abdomen, feeling the tiny heartbeat. "Hello, little one," I whispered. "You came at just the right time." In that moment, I heard, whether real or in my mind, grandmother's voice. "Time doesn't take anything away, my dear." And I knew everything was exactly where it should be, where life no longer demanded strength from anyone, only that they know warmth. It was morning in the small town, sunlight scattering through the glass like thin golden threads. Inside the bookstore, the smell of old paper mingled with the scent of mint. I reorganized a few novels on the shelf, looking out the window, where my daughter was playing in the garden with Ethan and Linda. A gentle breeze drifted through, making the wind chimes tinkle. And in that moment, I realized that the people who had once hurt me were now healing with me. Ethan laughed, bending down to tie his daughter's shoelace. Linda sat on the wooden bench, her eyes squinting slightly in the sun, her hands steadily weaving each stitch. The soft sound of the thread rubbing against the fabric was gentle, rhythmic as a breath. I stood there, my hand unconsciously resting on my abdomen. I smiled faintly. "Grandmother, I hear it now." No background music was needed, no other voice. Only the breath, the light, and a truly authentic rhythm of life. I walked out to the garden. The grass was wet, the smell of earth after the rain still lingering. My daughter was running around the lavender beds, giggling. She was holding the old clock, now strung up with a new ribbon. "Mom, look!" She held it up high, the sunlight reflecting off the silver face, sparkling like a tiny star. I nodded. "It's beautiful, my love." She tilted her head. "Why doesn't it run anymore?" I knelt down, looking into her blue eyes. "Because it's resting. Just like your great-grandmother, she's now resting in a quiet place." The little girl thought for a moment, then nodded. "Resting, but still watching me, right?" I smiled. "Always." She hugged the clock close to her chest, then ran off, her laughter echoing through the flower garden. Linda looked up, watching the child, her eyes strangely gentle. She continued knitting, the needle moving slowly, as if each stitch was mending the fractures in her heart. Ethan sat down beside his mother, holding a cup of tea. "She keeps asking about the clock," he said. "She thinks there's magic inside." Linda smiled softly. "There is. The magic is that people still believe in beauty, even if they can't see it." Then she leaned her head, her voice softening. "Do you remember, when you were little, you were afraid of the clock ticking at night?" Ethan nodded. "I thought it would stop when someone in the house left." "And now?" "Now I understand. It doesn't stop. It just changes its rhythm." Linda paused, her eyes welling up. "Now I finally dare to listen to it." I watched the two of them from a distance, the space between them now only the length of an unfinished woolen shawl. Sunlight shone over her shoulder, the light making the stitches visible, slightly trembling, breathtakingly beautiful. Ethan looked out at the garden, where our daughter was reaching up to catch the sunlight. He began to narrate in a low, slow voice, like reciting an old tale. "Once upon a time, there was a clock that listened. It only ticked when people forgot to love, and fell silent when they remembered." The little girl looked up, her eyes bright. "Like great-grandma, Daddy?" He smiled. "Yes, the story of the talking great-grandmother." Linda chuckled, saying softly, "Then I must have talked too much." "No," I replied. "You only spoke at the right time." The laughter of the three blended with the wind. I stood there, watching quietly, feeling as if all those years of pain were dissolving, leaving behind only warmth. In my mind, the letters from the past seemed to be rewritten, not with ink, but with breath, with light, with the way people were treating each other. When the sun dipped low, I returned to the bookstore, took out the old notebook, and opened a new page. I wrote, "Grandmother, the past never sleeps, but it can lie down if we are gentle enough. The things that once terrified me are now the things I am grateful for." I put down the pen, hearing the door open. Ethan walked in, holding our daughter, with Linda following, carrying the completed shawl. "It's finished," she said, handing me the small white and purple blanket. "For the baby that's coming." I took it, touching each stitch, and smiled. "Thank you, Mom." She touched my shoulder. "No, thank you, for teaching me how to live again." I nodded softly, feeling her hand warm like the late afternoon sun. Outside, the wind whispered gently. My daughter ran across the yard, hugging the clock that sparkled in the sun, the new ribbon flying like a butterfly. I listened to my heart harmonize with my child's laughter, the rhythm slow, steady, and real. And in that moment, I understood. There are some letters that don't need to be sent. They only need to be written, through the way we live kindly with the people who once hurt us. It was a late November afternoon, the air just cold enough to crave a hot cup of tea. I stood in the kitchen, brewing tea, the scent of mint and lavender blending and filling the house. Steam rose vaguely, weaving into the pale light filtering through the window. The light of the Thanksgiving season, quiet and gentle as a breath after a long year. On the table, the baked goods were still warm, the smell of butter and cinnamon mixing with the tea. Linda was setting the dishes, her gaze focused yet soft. Ethan was hanging a wreath on the door, and my daughter ran around singing and laughing, her voice crystal clear. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling lightly, just a few flakes, dissolving before they touched the ground. I looked through the glass, feeling time slowing down, making space for the small things we were once too rushed to notice. On the shelf near the window, the stone tower clock reflected the afternoon light. It wasn't running, but still faintly vibrated. Whenever the wind blew, the second hand would gently tremble, as if it were still listening. I set the teapot down, sat at the table, and looked at it for a long time. Every tremor of the clock felt like the heartbeat of the house, no longer running with time, but living with it. I whispered softly, "No need to run anymore, Grandmother. We've learned our rhythm." The words dissolved into the tea steam, the lavender scent, and the growing warmth in the room. Ethan turned to me, smiling. "Did you say something?" I shook my head. "No, just saying thank you." "For what?" "For us still sitting here together." Linda heard me, placing the last plate on the table. "In the old days," she said, "I thought Thanksgiving meant having all the right dishes, all the right people. Now I see, having peace is enough." Ethan replied, "Maybe that's this year's main course." My daughter climbed onto her chair, holding up a tiny teacup. "Cheers!" We laughed, raising our cups in response. That laughter spilled onto the porch, blending into the wind that was gently changing direction. As the meal began, I silently watched the three people before me. They no longer resembled the figures in the old memories, no longer afraid, no longer keeping their distance. This house, once full of secrets and silence, now echoed with soft laughter, the clinking of cutlery, the sound of the wind through the curtains. After dinner, I went out to the garden. The lavender was dry but still held its fragrance. The mint was stripped of leaves, only a few small sprigs striving to bloom under the mist. I sat down on the old wooden chair, pulling a shawl around my shoulders. The cold air numbed my skin, but my heart felt strangely warm. From afar, I could hear Linda singing an old lullaby to my daughter, a melody that was thin and real, like the steps of a memory returning without the pain. On the porch, Ethan turned on the light. The glow spilled out onto the garden, a soft yellow. He walked over, placing his hand on my shoulder. "Still thinking about her?" "Always," I said. "But it's different now. Now I think of her as part of this light." He was silent for a moment, then spoke quietly. "Mom said she once believed that if someone is still remembered with kindness, that person never truly leaves." I smiled. "Maybe that's why the clock still trembles." He followed my gaze. The clock hung under the porch awning, silently reflecting the light, not running, not ticking, just gently vibrating in the wind. We stood there, in silence. No more words were needed, because everything that needed to be said was embodied in the way we were living. Then the wind picked up, strong enough to rattle the string of dried leaves on the porch. It swept through the garden, the rustling leaves sounding like gentle, aged laughter. I closed my eyes, listening to that sound spread everywhere, over the roof, through the walls, through the years that had passed. It was like someone, from a distance, was still smiling, and I smiled back, not because of perfect happiness, but because I finally understood. Peace does not come from forgetting the past, but from looking back at it without trembling. Inside the house, the light still shone through the window, warm and calm. Outside, the wind still blew, gentle and real, as if this winter had just begun, and we still had so much to be thankful for. That afternoon, the sky dissolved into a pale golden hue. The last light of the day skimmed across the lake's surface, and I stood on the porch, watching the water reflect the sunset. The surface was so calm, I could see the whole sky contained within it, the thin clouds, the final rays of light, and my own shadow, standing still. I heard a soft laugh behind me. I turned around to see Linda, Ethan, and my daughter sitting together in the warm light. Linda was reading the little girl a story, her voice low and slow, pausing occasionally, as if catching her breath. Ethan sat beside them, his hand resting on his mother's shoulder, a small gesture, yet wonderfully warm. My daughter looked up and asked, "Was Great-Grandma real?" Linda smiled, stroking the child's soft hair. "Yes, she was. But she lives in a place where you have to be silent to hear her. Like when the wind blows, Grandma." "Yes, exactly like that." I leaned against the porch column, letting the light embrace me. This feeling, peaceful, as if life had finally agreed to sit down with me, unhurried, undemanding. I listened to my heartbeat harmonize with the rhythm of the wind, slow, real, and calm. A single leaf drifted down onto the steps. I watched it float in the air, slowly landing, and coming to rest by my heel. The world didn't need to be any more than this to be complete. From a distance, the grandmother's voice seemed to resonate. Time doesn't stop. It only chooses those who are worthy to listen. I wasn't startled. The voice didn't come to unsettle me, but to preserve what had become gentle. It was like a breath passing through a crack in the door, light and true. I replied softly in a breath, "I hear you, grandmother." The sky shifted to the color of honey. The light spread across the garden, shining on the dry lavender stalks and the stone clock tower in front of the house. The silver clock still lay motionless on the shelf, its hands frozen, but the light hitting it made it gently shimmer, as if it were still listening. My daughter ran over and hugged my legs. "Mom, can we go to the lake?" I bent down, touching her soft hair. "Tomorrow," I said. "The lake will still be there." She nodded, her eyes bright and clear as the water. Linda stood up, still holding the book. "It's getting cold," she said. "Let's go inside." Ethan helped his mother up, the action natural. no longer strained as it once was. They walked ahead and I lingered, watching the light slowly retract from the lake. As the darkness began to spread, the wind shifted its tone. It wasn't cold, just a whisper. In that breeze, I heard one more sentence. I didn't know if it was the grandmother's voice or my own thought softly spoken. It's not blood that keeps us together, but the way we choose to love. That sentence, so simple, made my heart constrict and then expand. I turned and stepped inside. The house was bathed in a golden glow from the small lamps. Linda was pouring tea, the steam creating a thin veil between her and the light. Ethan was spreading a cloth on the table. My daughter was arranging the small cups, humming an unnamed song. I stood watching the scene. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. In this house, every breath, every movement carried the gentle rhythm of a love that didn't need to be shouted. Ethan looked up and saw me. "Are you okay?" I nodded. "I've never been better." He walked over, putting his arm around my shoulder. "I still think about her, about how it all started." I smiled. "And I think about how it all stopped, at the right time." He nodded, his eyes holding the clarity of someone who has learned to let go. "Then we're good," he said. Outside, the wind blew softly through the garden. The light from inside the house reflected on the lake, shimmering like a heart still beating, still alive, still loving. I looked around, the house, my family, the small sounds, and took a deep breath. Nothing more was needed. No one had to prove anything. Only peace. Not bright, not promising, not perfect. Just real. And I knew, if time had a soul, it was smiling. Because finally, we had learned to live with it instead of against it. If you have ever walked through wounds that only time could soften, if you have ever learned how to love again from the very people who once caused you pain, then perhaps you will also understand why I choose to call this peace. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching this story from? And what kept you with me until the very end? And if you believe that every family can find its own rhythm of love, hit that subscribe button to join me on the journey ahead, because the next story could be your own.